Around the world, and I think I've already mentioned this, it's interesting to see how nuclear forms a percentage of the world's different countries have chosen nuclear to be part of their energy production, electricity production. And, you know, Lithuania heads that list there, but it's a small country. France, 78% we've mentioned, right through, and Australia, of course, is zero. It's not on that graph, but some other significant, I guess, developed countries, Germany, 28%, Japan, 25%, USA, 20%. All contributing, Sweden around 50%. There's a lot of countries have chosen nuclear to be part of the energy production, electricity production, and been doing it for quite a while. And if we look around, we also hear now some environmental people who these days are saying, well, perhaps we need to consider nuclear because of this issue about carbon dioxide production, what can replace fossil fuels, and, you know, surely renewables can play a part, but we look what options are available right now, what options are being used for the last 40 or so years in other countries around the world, then we need to reconsider nuclear. The nuclear fuel cycle. It's called that, but it doesn't really operate as a cycle anywhere in the world quite in completion. But in the ideal, you've got a uranium mine, such as in Olympic Dam in Australia, takes the ore out, turns it into yellowcake, which is uranium oxide. That's taken to a place where it's converted into a gas, uranium hexafluoride, and that's enriched. That's to give more of that uranium-235, that part that produces energy, compared to the uranium-238. So you get up to about 4%, for example, uranium-235 in the fuel, so you get more power out of the fuel. That enrichment, then you have to take the enriched gas, turn it back into either the uranium metal or the uranium oxide or whatever the fuel's going to be made of, create the fuel, put it into a reactor, and then afterwards, most countries, read the United States, just then puts it into pools and lets it sit there. Other countries, such as France and the United Kingdom, keep going and reprocess it and take that fuel, extract out the uranium that hasn't been used and take some other plutonium and put that back into fuel, what's called a mixed oxide fuel, and put it back into reactors. So they do have a cycle. But even theirs is not completely complete because they take the waste and then reprocess it, turn it into a glass where the radioactive wastes are locked up in the glass, and then they've got that there ready to be stored. And they're planning, in some countries, for repositories to store them. Australia has an important part to play in that cycle. We have the world's largest amounts of uranium reserves. And if you took low cost, which was a few years ago, around the $35 mark, then we had around 38% of the world's reserves. Our current production is about 10,000 tonnes, and even though we've now taken away the limitation on 3 uranium mines, our growth is affected by state government, I guess, views towards it. So really we're confined to the South Australia and Northern Territory. Western Australia, Queensland, at present their state governments don't allow uranium mining. We've had a research reactor. My organisation has run one since 1958, and we still run one. We don't use that for power. We're just producing radiopharmaceuticals for nuclear medicine treatments, and we use it for studying materials, take the neutrons that come out of the reactions and use them to probe and understand what's happening inside things. And we use it for doing other things such as doping semiconductors and the like. But that's a research reactor, very small core, only a few kilograms of uranium, not the tonnes you'd have inside a power plant. Australia also had a nuclear review in 2006, led by Ziggy Sikowski, and it saw what role could nuclear power have in Australia. The driver, of course, is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They said, you know, we probably could have a reactor if we really got our act together within 10 to 15 years. And they thought we could be producing about 25 gigawatts by 2050. And that would probably, that's about half of our current installed producing capacity. But we could reduce the total CO2 emissions by about 18%. But they acknowledged production costs were significantly higher than coal at this stage, that really to get over that barrier of entry, we'd need significant subsidies. And one of those ways to get over a barrier to entry is to put a carbon price on. And so right now people are talking about emissions trading and carbon credits and carbon taxes, and that, of course, would change the economics. What about public support in Australia? Well, the Climate Institute did a review last February last year, and said, you know, what are the public's favourite energy options? And if you add up the percentages, it reaches more than 100% because the public always can't make up their mind and choose more than one. But, you know, good news. Solar is Australia's population's most favourite way to produce energy. We just don't do enough of it. And then wind, another way they thought about saving energy, solving energy problems, do you actually use less of it? And you can see nuclear, at least 30% or so people are willing to consider it. If you actually ask the direct questions, are you in favour or not of nuclear power, then taking a range of surveys back to May 2006, you've seen we've gone from 51% against in May 2006 to May 2007, where 51% were actually supporting nuclear power. And there's some March data along the way. But what are the real issues in dealing with the production of nuclear power? There's the safety issues. There's the proliferation issues. Put more nuclear power stations, there's more nuclear material. You've got to look after the material so it doesn't get diverted where you don't want it to go, which is in nuclear weapons. Not surprising, Australia is a major exporter of uranium, is probably one of the largest, loudest voices in the world to put in good proliferation, anti-proliferation regimes to make sure that the nuclear material doesn't end up where it shouldn't. There's the wastes, there's the costs, there's infrastructure requirements. You know, we wanted to build a power station today, we couldn't do it. We don't have a regulatory regime. How are we going to set up our fuel supply? Just because it's got the ore in the ground doesn't help us. We're not part of we don't have the people who manufacture the fuel. And what about the wastes for dealing with infrastructure too? And I think probably the biggest barrier, community acceptance. You know, if we did that survey I talked about now, perhaps we've gone down from that. But let me tell you that people's support of nuclear is dependent on your distance. So that 51% in favour changed to about 40% if you said, do you want one in your state? And they changed to about 20% if they said, do you want one in your region? But what about wastes? Well, I guess on a volume issue, then the coal-fired power stations have got the big volume problems of the ash, the slurry, as well as the large amounts of CO2 they put up into the air. Actually, interesting, there's radioactive material coming out of power stations because as you burn coal, there's radioactive material in that coal, and you're burning a lot of coal, so the amount of uranium and thorium coming out is significant over a year. Nuclear doesn't produce much volume materials, 5 tonnes of immediate level waste, 87.6 thousand tonnes of CO2, and about 100 tonnes of spent fuel that have to be dealt with. So the volumes are small. Another way of looking at the waste issue is to say, let's put a cost, it's an economic way of doing it, on the various things that can be produced from power generation, CO2, carbon monoxide. And you could argue the economic model about the costs that were put on these things. The $30 a tonne comes because that's sort of like the high end of a carbon tax. And put in the other economic costs of the things we don't like lead, nitrous oxides, particulates, sulphur oxides, those things. Then you add them up for the various ways of producing, what's the waste cost of producing a kilowatt hour of electricity. And you can see for wind, it's really, really low cost. And then coal, you know, depending if you're New South Wales, low end, Victoria, high end, and natural gas there, and solar PV, and nuclear is low, not as low as wind, but the actual cost, because the volumes are so small, is not a large cost. What about costs? Well, in nuclear, the costs are dominated by the capital. 58% in this model was coming from there. It's actually interesting, this is the average cost, and this one's actually, I think, in cents per kilowatt hour. So if you multiply that by 10, you get back to the number I had, which was dollars per megawatt hour. So they're saying at the moment, around about the late 1980s, it peaked around $35 per megawatt hour, or 3.7 cents per kilowatt hour. But over time it's come down, and that's because for 2 reasons. One is they're paying off their capital. They haven't been building new power plants for quite a while. And the other is that their reliability has been going right up. So they used to be around about 70% availability, now they're around the high 90s. Nuclear power in the US is a very reliable, and because the capital has already been paid off, very economically viable method of doing it. And here's the same information all coming compared against the other ways of producing power in oil, gas and coal.